as you get older, I think it's important to really get your execution and um, technique and everything dialed in because, again, when you're younger, you can get away with like, hey, if your form's off a little bit, it's no big deal. Like you're going to be fine. Whereas as you get older, you have all that wear and tear of everything else that you did for years.
Welcome to another episode of Wits and Weights. Today, we're going to dive into two important topics, weight maintenance and recovery, with my special guest, Jeff Hoehn, who has tons of hands-on, tons of coaching experience with both nutrition and training and lots of other topics. Living at maintenance, managing fatigue, managing recovery. I think they're often overlooked. They're misunderstood by many people who want to improve their body composition. And I think Jeff's going to reveal why they're relevant if you care about the long game. In terms of sustaining that hard-won fat loss and being able to train into your later years, among other things. And as always on this show, we're going to share evidence-based strategies that you can take action on starting today. Jeff has gone through his own personal transformation through several building and fat loss phases. He's competed in bodybuilding shows. He's tried just about every diet, every training method out there. He's dealt with injuries and rehab, and through it all, learned about the science and practice of human performance and nutrition. Jeff is the owner of JH Health and Fitness. He's also an online coach who helps clients get leaner, stronger, and more confident. He believes, and I couldn't agree more, that coaching is a collaborative process where clients should be empowered with knowledge, empowered with skills. I invited Jeff on because I'm a huge fan of his podcast, The Mind Muscle Connection, and I can relate to his self-experimentation, his curiosity for learning. On his podcast, Jeff interviews well-known experts like Mike Israetel, Steve Hall, and others, and he shares actionable tips in his solo episodes, like the recent one he did, number 262, on the laws of maintenance, which are relevant to today's discussion. So make sure to follow the Mind Muscle Connection. And Jeff, it's an honor to welcome you to the show.
Philip, thank you. That was a great introduction. Like I told you off air, man, I'm really impressed by your the amount of work that you put in ahead of time. I'm a little ashamed of myself now after this, but no, I appreciate you having me on, and I'm glad that you wanted to talk about these specific topics because I think they are super important and probably something that's maybe a little bit on paper boring, but I think it's awesome and a great chat to have. So I'm looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, cool. No, I mean, I can nerd out on this stuff forever and people know me. No, I do. And I don't find any of this boring, and we're going to make it exciting and interesting and people understand why they need to know it. So no, I appreciate the compliment. And I do love your podcast. It's great. You've, cover a lot of topics, have a lot of guests, the solo episodes, some of your mysterious teasers are like, here's a topic I find interesting. And then, it's like, what is he talking about today? So that's good. So let's get to know you a bit. Let the audience get to know you if they're not already familiar with your work. I guess I want to understand your motivation and vision for taking your past history with personal fitness, what you've learned, your experiences, and then sharing it with the world specifically through coaching and podcasting.
Yeah. So, for me, I think I got into fitness to just, look better. Like I wanted to have bigger muscles and everything like that. And, that was, I think that's how most people get into it, right? I'm sure it's probably the same for you, but along the journey, you find out that there's a lot more to it than just that. And so for me, that was something that, again, I got into it for that, but figuring out that, hey, there's a lot more than just having bigger muscles or looking better, right? Like that's important. But I feel like it taught me a lot of life lessons and it just had a lot of carryover to other aspects of my life. And so for me, I want to help people get to that point, right? Like obviously I want to help them look better, but I think that's part of it. But I also want to teach, other people that, how it can carry over to other aspects of your life. And it's just basically fitness and nutrition is just something that I feel like makes everything else you do better. Like if that's, if you're taking care of that, like everything else you do is better, right? And there's a lot of carryover to whether you own your own business, you're an employee somewhere, relationships, managing money. I feel like there's a lot of carryover. And so for me, I just feel like that's the one thing that if you can get that nailed down, I just feel like other aspects of your life get better. And so for me, that's, why I want to do it. And I also feel like too, along the way, I'm sure you feel this way as well. There was just a lot of things that I probably did at one time that weren't great. And I could have spent a lot of time and hard work. And just, listen, and now obviously with like social media and, just the access of information, the ease of information that we can get, we have all this access to all this information, there's a lot of stuff that I feel like isn't great. And so I just want to, help people get to that point to where they fitness and nutrition can be a part of their lifestyle. Obviously, push like getting results, but also making sure that it's not this like all or nothing mindset and like these crazy
Mhm.
protocols that just, they aren't going to work for most people. I think the big one, and I'm going to kind of go off on a tangent here. I think the big thing too is with social media, I feel like it's so easy to get in this like comparison game too with social media. And so like, the other thing I really want to like help people with is realizing that what you see on social media isn't necessarily like, you shouldn't compare yourself to that. I'm sure, as a coach yourself, like you had these conversations all the time where it's like, hey, I know you want to, look like this, but realize that that person's completely different than you are. And
Yep.
like, it's the people that get shown in your feeds are probably the outliers to most things. And so like, helping people with that, I think is super important too. So, that's, like I said, kind of went off on a side tangent there, but those are the things that kind of came to my mind when you asked
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, totally. And I can relate to a lot of that. I'm sure the listener can. It's probably why they listen to your show, my show, and others like it. Podcasting gives us that medium to be able to dive into that next level. I mean, the amount of research you put into some of your shows, right? You can tell it shows that you care about breaking it down to the level where people understand why, they understand what to do. And it's not just like, 1, 2, 3, buy my program. It's not, this clickbaity thing, even though we have to use the social media regardless. The other thing you said is how it expands to other areas of your life. And it made me think about how, when you ask a client, what's your goal? And they say, I want to lose weight. Or what's your goal? I want to look good. And you're like, okay, why do you want that? Right. And then they go to that next level. All right, I want to feel better. Okay. Why? And you dig in and dig in. And that's kind of that deeper meaning for why we do this and why you want to help. But you also mentioned how it impacts other areas of your life. And I think that applies to mastery of anything, right? Like if you become a master of marketing, become a master of public speaking, it tends to transcend that into other things. And that's being a human, right? It's being like a capable, awesome human in this world. So would you say like your overall coaching philosophy and values, how would you pin them down based on all of this discussion?
Yeah. So I guess my coaching values would be, obviously, you know, re- client comes to you, they want to look better, right? Like again, what that's going to be what we're going to push for, right? Like that is super important. So making sure that, we get the client's results, like that's going to
Sure.
be at the forefront. But also I think, some other values I have there is, obviously education is going to be super important. Like I think that's
Yeah.
important because I always tell clients this, if, let's say for example, they do want to look better, that's, again, we're going to aim for that. But if we're learning better habits along the way and we're learning like more about your body or things like that, like those are going to be things that you can take with you moving forward. Whereas like, like we could get anybody to lose
Right.
15 pounds if we make the protocol drastic enough. But it's like, is that going to be something that you're going to learn anything there? You're going to be able to take that with you moving forward. So, I always tell clients like that's one of the main things is just the education piece and learning about yourself, but also, better strategies as well. So I think that's important. Man, what else would be super important in terms of, obviously everything I do, like, I think there is a sense of like, we want to push the client, but at the same time, and we want to get them uncomfortable, but also making sure that what we're doing is something that's, they're not feeling like crap in the process. I think that's
Hmm.
super
Hmm.
important, and making sure that, they're feeling good in the process. And again, it's not something they hate because again, that's not going to be anything that they can, do for a long period of time. So I think that's important. Obviously communicating with the clients is super important, why we're doing what we're doing. Again, that goes back to the education piece, but communicating along the way. And you kind of hit on it too, like with the coaching process, it's not just hey, this is what we're doing, go and do it. It's, it's a collaboration too, right? Like
Yeah.
I,
Yeah,
I,
for
I want
sure.
to make sure that, you have a piece of like what's going on too, because again, that's going to be something that's going to fit best for you, but also, if you are helping make those decisions, I feel like you're going to be more likely to
Right.
want to actually do them rather than me being like, hey, go do this. Right. Some clients want that, but again, I still think it's important to, even if a client, that's what they want, I still think it's important to push them a little bit towards that. And I think I made a post on this the other day about like, again, we want to get a client uncomfortable. And I think that looks different from each client,
Hmm.
right? So for
Sure.
like one client, it could be, hey, it is going to be more of a collaborative process where you're going to have more of an input here. And I'm not just going to be like, hey, go and do this. Now, again, there might be some of that, but we're still going to try to push you to be uncomfortable there. And for one client, it could be, they do just need to like do something different, and they might need to listen a little, they might need to
For
like
sure.
listen
Yeah.
to something a little bit more. And then also too, like, and we'll probably talk about this, but like for one client, it could be, hey, you need to stay consistent with your workouts. That's what you need. But for another client, it could be, hey, we need to back off a little bit, right? So it looks different for everybody. But I would say those are kind of the big things there. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, for sure, man. So the education, the awareness, and you kind of touched on, I don't know if it's you posted or somebody else said, you know, you don't always have to be a nice guy, but always be kind. I don't know who said that, but kind of the idea of we push our clients, and you mentioned being uncomfortable. That's kind of every day when you're trying to change, is it's something different, right? And it may be a good uncomfortable, or it may be a very uncomfortable version of that. So these are awesome, right? That's what I think people want to do, but people do have to understand they can't just do the same thing over and over and see results. So I know we want to jump into the topic, and this is kind of relevant because when we talk about weight maintenance, we're talking about sustaining your body weight, and there's a lot of there's a lot of places you come from to get to that state, right? We don't just say, okay, I want to maintain weight. There's a reason for that. But it's almost a state of non-change, right? And so some people have their trouble wrapping their head around this idea, or that it's boring. And I get it from personal experience, man, because I'm just finishing a fat loss phase, and when I'm done, I don't want to maintain weight for too long. I want to go right into the building phase, So, high level, what are your overall thoughts on weight maintenance and these concepts?
Yeah. Well, so I think first, the thing that's important to look at is people do hear maintenance and they automatically think that it's like, okay, hey, no progress whatsoever, right? And that's obviously not the case. We'll continue to dive into this, but like, I think that's the first thing that people need to know is like maintenance isn't necessarily you're just not making progress at all, right? It's more so like your body weight is at maintenance, but there's a lot of things that can go on. So I think that's the first thing that needs to that I need to hit on first before we dive into this is it's still progress, right? Next, I think again, people hear maintenance and they automatically just think it's not like making progress. But to me, any nutrition strategy or exercise strategy or any protocols that we're going to do that gets you to maintain weight long term is a win, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
what do most people have problems with? It's seeing weight gain, over time. And so I think a lot of times when people hear like certain protocols or something that's not weight loss, they automatically think it's not good, right? But it's like weight maintenance, like that's a big thing, especially in today's
It's
world.
huge.
So,
Yeah.
I think that's important. Those are kind of the two big things that I always tell people about when they hear maintenance. So as far as like, so those are kind of a couple things there with that. I don't know if you want me to dive into like maybe, yeah, go ahead. I don't know if you have
Yeah,
anything.
no. Don't worry. I have a million questions. I always do. We always go off on tangents, and I don't get half to half of them. It's okay. We're having a conversation. So, the idea that it's still progress. You said a lot of other things going on. It's a long-term success strategy in that at some point you're going to lose weight potentially and want to keep it off, or gain weight and want to keep it, whatever. Something like 95% of people gain all their weight back, right? And Brandon was telling me the other day some other sobering statistics about that. But there's challenges and difficulties here because of the fact that you're trying to stay steady. It's almost more difficult in some ways than going up or down, right? So what are those challenges people face?
Yeah. Well, like you said, I think again, it's the fact that, oh, hey, maintenance is not progress, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I commonly see, I think this will be helpful is like what you commonly see in the fitness industry is, people, they get into, they want to do fat loss. So then they want to lose weight. So they restrict calories, do a bunch of cardio and they see this weight trend down super quick. And it ends up being these, we talked about sustainability earlier. And I think that's super important. And when people do it that way, they lose weight quickly, but then they're miserable in the process.
Mm.
Probably lost some lean body mass in the process as well. So muscle, they lose that. And then, what happens, you start eating like you did before and the weight comes back on quickly. The problem with that is, now you have less muscle, weight's going to come back on quicker. So then you gain weight. So then like over time, what you see happen here is you see these people, they trend down and then weight comes back up. It might stay the same. It might go a little bit higher, but the problem there is you're going to have more fat mass in that process. Cause anytime you lose weight and you lose muscle in the process, your body's going to gain most of that weight. And if you do it quickly, your body's going to gain most of that weight back via fat, right?
That's fat. Yep.
So this is what ends up happening. And then people, then what happens? And, a couple weeks, months go by. Hey, let's do that again. Right. And it just ends up being this yo-yo with over time, a little bit more fat mass, and a little less muscle. So I like to I like to have what I call a maintenance phase. You can call it reverse diet phase, whatever it may be, where after that fat loss diet, we're going to bring you back to, we're going to find a way to eat that's going to, maintain your weight. Maybe it comes up a little bit, but we're just going to avoid that like super, that increase in
The
food
big
and
spike. Yeah.
the big spike after you lose weight, lose body fat, whatever it may be. The biggest challenges that I see people have with this is, so anytime you lose body fat, and or you're in a calorie deficit, like for a long period of time, you're going to see something, you're going to see hunger come up a little bit. You might have a little less energy. And so when that happens, your body wants to get back to where it was before. And
Mhm.
so, and that's why you see an increase in hunger, like energy levels are lower, things like that. And so if you just go straight back to eating like you did before, again, you're going to see things come back up. So I think the first main challenge is like hunger super high after that period of time, right? And if you just listen to your body and you don't do anything, that's why you see that come, like why it's so hard to maintain your weight afterwards, right? Because again, your body wants to get back to where it was before. So I think that's the first challenge is like hunger super high, and so it can be really hard to moderate your food intake. But then on top of it, a lot of times people restrict themselves for a long period of time. And then, what happens? You want to start to eat tasty food again. So people go straight back into eating tasty food, and you're already hungry. And these types of foods are already really tough to moderate because they're just designed to get you to overeat and continue to eating
Sure.
and keep wanting more. But then you combine it with the fact that, hey, you're already hungrier. So you just want more and more, right? So it becomes really challenging to, to moderate your food intake. It's almost, it's basically like a cheat code to eat more calories, right? These types of foods that are easily available, tasty foods.
Yeah. And hold on, are we talking? And were you talking about the scenario for anybody who's lost weight, whether you are training, eating protein, and all the things, or not? Or are we talking a specific scenario here?
Yeah, I mean, both people, even,
Yep.
People that on the way down that don't lift weights or their protein's low, they're going to be at probably they're going to see this happen. Like they're going to be at a higher risk of all this stuff. Right. But
Sure.
even if you do lose body weight, lose body fat, and you're, lifting weights, eating enough protein, this is still going to happen to you. Right. It's just probably not going to be as bad, in that scenario. But yeah, both people, they're going to see this happen. So, but yeah, those are some challenges. Another challenge too, and some mistakes that people will make in this period of time afterwards is, again, it's like people go all in during the fat loss phase, and then Monday comes around, it's like, oh, maintenance, I'm not in fat loss diet, and I'm just going to go back to doing whatever I was doing before, right? And whether that's like not tracking anything. So again, tracking can be like your body weight, it can be like your biofeedback. Maybe you're not moving as much. Like it's like, oh, hey, I don't have to lose body fat anymore, so now I'm just not going to move as much. And all these things add up, right? And then you combine it with what I talked about with your hunger increasing. And then too, like people will stop like weighing in because it's like, oh, hey, I had that goal of like seeing weight come down. So now I'm not going to weigh in anymore. And I'm not sure, what, like some people have, some people like to have people weigh in regularly. Some people don't. It just, I think, depends on the client and what their relationship is with the scale. But that goes back to the education piece. I really try to teach clients how to understand what's going on with scale weight, because I think that's super important. So I think if you have if you have a coach with you that can help you with this, like it's good to continue to track your body
Yeah,
weight
well,
during that
we're on the
time.
same page there. I don't know if you listen to my stuff. I'm always talking about tracking, and even the value of daily weight tracking as an antidote for that emotional tie-in with the scale. It actually seems to help because now you've got the data. So, totally agree there. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, and then, people, they stop tracking that, right? So then it's
yeah,
like,
sure.
it can be a way to just kind of help you moderate your food. Like, again, if you see your weight go up a little bit, it's like, whoa, okay, I probably need to back off a little bit, right? But if you're not focused on that, it's like you don't have anything to kind of get you to pump the brakes a little bit, right?
As
So
an incentive, yeah, yeah,
I think the big thing is to go back to all this and to tie it all in. I think that the missing piece for a lot of people here is this kind of planned approach to fat loss, right? Like, yes, the fat loss diet is important, but what do you do after that is super important as well too. Because if you're missing out on that part afterwards, I feel like you're going to end up having to do the same thing over and
right.
over and over again. So, I think having some things set up after that period of time is super important. Like, for example, I just had a client, he had to go through a pretty hard weight cut for an MMA fight. So like what we had to do for him would be a little bit different than a lifestyle client, but
Mhm.
he put his body through the ringer to get this weight down. And, afterwards, one of his main things he wanted to work on with me was he had to do this multiple times. And after each fight, he wouldn't, he would just go back to his normal life. He would be super hungry. And so he would just kind of go on these
Binges.
eating sprees. Yeah, binges, basically, where he would just eat anything, everything, drink. And, then he would get up to a weight that, when he was trying to fight again, he'd have to lose a bunch of weight. And it's this process that would go over and over again. And so, like, for him, some of his challenges have been, he's super hungry. And so we're talking about, hey, like, we just have to increase the amount of food that you were eating. Like, for example, don't just go straight from like eating all these quote unquote diet foods to then all of a sudden going back to, pizza all the time and like tasty foods. Like, we got to still eat, for the most part, the same foods, just in larger quantities, right?
Yep. Yeah. So, what I'm hearing from some of this, right, and people need to understand, is that the fat loss phase itself, as you're going through it and as you're getting toward maintenance, that's when we start doing the prep work for maintenance, right? Like, there's ways to do that. And I also pull from this that, at least for a lifestyle client, like a Gen Pop, I don't want a client to just cut everything out that they enjoy during a fat loss phase. We want to try to build them in. We're not talking about, the 24-hour cuts and the MMA fighters necessarily here who have to, or bodybuilders who have to get more dialed in. But it's like, if you're at least allowing for some of that and then accommodating it, you have those skills, right, as you come out of it. So what are the things someone would do? Let's say a 12 or 16-week fat loss phase, you're maybe halfway through and thinking ahead toward maintenance. What's the best way to prepare for that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is just realize that, yes, the fat loss portion of it's over, but you're still going to need to put in the work afterwards, right? I think mentally preparing yourself for that can be helpful, but, just realize that you are going to get a little bit more flexibility with food, right? You get a little bit more quantity. So that will be helpful there. Some other things too, make sure that you have a game plan for, weight training, movement, right? I think that's another big thing. So make sure you have some goals set up there with that. Again, we want to make sure we weight train, because the big thing too is, we talked about weight training a little bit ago, but I've made this post before. I think if you do see a little bit of weight gain, what you do in that process is important too, right? Like, if you're not weight training and you're gaining weight, it's like, okay, that's going to be different than gaining a little bit of weight in weight training, right? So, making sure you have that set up. Movement, again, make sure you're still, whether no matter, like, however you track your cardio or steps or whatever it is, make sure you still have a game plan there with that. But from a nutrition standpoint, what I tell clients is, like I said, just, we're still going to eat relatively the same amount of the same foods, just we're going to increase the quantities. But, I guess you could, if you have I always tell clients I like to have them have a set amount of meals per day, because I think that really allows for some structure. So I think making sure you still have that in place, making sure you're still, doing your prep work, whether that's going to the grocery store, prepping, making sure you're still doing those things, I think can be really helpful there.
For sure.
To help you prepare for that time.
Cool. Yeah. What about, you talked about getting back to a certain weight. We talked about either reverse dieting or recovery dieting, whatever term you want to use. Should people be concerned about set point theory? Is that a thing? I know the evidence is mixed about it, the idea that we all have a weight range where we stabilize. And so when we think of maintenance, is there an artificial weight that we're trying to maintain at that's counterproductive versus this set point weight?
Yeah. I definitely think there is some truth to that. So I think what they call it now, and like what the model that they think is like the most effective is called like the dual point intervention model, right? So it's like we have this high end where, like, once you get to a certain body fat level on the high end, it's like things start to kick in where it's like, hey, whoa, chill out. Like, your body's going to try to expend more energy, like basically the opposite of when you're trying to lose weight. But then when you get to a body fat level on the other end, it's like, then this is where you really see hunger start to kick up. Like, you may see your libido go down the drain. Sleep might start to suffer, energy levels suck, right? And anything in between there is where your body's like comfortable, right? So like in that range for people, I don't know if people can see me obviously on a podcast, but like that range could differ from person to person, right? Like for one person, that top end could be super high. So it's like their body's just going to want to keep gaining weight. For some people, that bottom point could be really low, so they can just keep losing weight. But for some people, it's like, it's really small, right? Their body just really wants to stay where it's at. So I definitely think there's some, we do need to take that in consideration. But at the end of the day, what your habits are, I feel like are going to really determine where you fall at on that scale,
Sure.
in that range, right? And one other thing too that I feel like is important here with this is, and why I think maintenance is important. And again, when we say maintenance, like I think maintenance can be like a phase where you're just not trying to push body weight up or down. It can
Mhm.
be a phase where maybe you're just trying to take some stress off the body,
Recovery.
but
Yep.
it can also just be like your calorie amount too, right? I think something like, I think that needs to be like, people need to figure like, I guess I just need to explain that ahead of time. Like, hey, it just really depends on like, what are you trying to do with it? So there's different ways, but
Are you
what
are you
I,
saying are you saying the term maintenance as in referring to your expenditure, your true maintenance versus maintaining your weight? Is that the distinction you're making?
yeah, basically, like I think there's a difference in terms of like, okay, is a maintenance phase like a maintenance phase can be a phase where we're just trying to take some stress off, right? We're not trying to push body weight up. We're not trying to push performance. We're not trying to
Mhm.
push body weight down. We're just, just trying to find a good range to stay at, basically homeostasis for your body, right? Now I'll
Sure.
kind of get to that in a minute, why that's important. But also there's maintenance calories, right? And I think again, there's a difference there because maintenance calories is just your energy balance, right? And yes, you're not going to lose body fat if your calories are at maintenance, but you could still, depending on where you're at in your training or training journey, you could still build some muscle at maintenance, right? So
For sure.
so I think there's a difference there in terms of like just because you're at maintenance calories doesn't mean you're at like maintenance, like a maintenance phase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
And well, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, no, go ahead. You have a thought.
Well, what I was going to say is the reason why we want to do this is because, and to kind of tie in the dual intervention model that I was just talking about, like where your body's comfortable, is pushing your body weight up or down is a stressor on the body, right?
Yep.
Like if you push your body weight up for too long, your body's going to start to have some adaptations to that, right? And this is where you see a lot of like the general population is at, where like they're just in this chronic energy surplus, right? Where their weight's going up and up. And this is where you start to see, the adaptations to that end up being like type 2 diabetes, like
Yep.
insulin resistance, things like that, right? And so that's the adaptation there for that. Whereas the adaptation on the way down is would be called more like metabolic adaptation, right? Whereas like when you continue to push your body weight down, your body's going to have these adaptations in place to just be like, hey, we got to chill out here. We can't just keep losing more and more weight. The best way I can explain this is think back to how we evolved for like most of our time on Earth, right? We didn't have this abundance of food. It was, you had to expend a ton of energy to go and get food, right? For pretty much all our existence. Whereas like in the last like 30, 50 years, now you can literally, you don't have to expend any energy other than pressing
Mhm.
numbers on your phone and you can get 5,000 calories, right? So there's this kind of like mismatch now where our bodies are just, it's just a lot different now. And again, so like back in the day when we didn't have all this abundance of energy around, our bodies are really good at being like, okay, if we don't have a lot of food around, we need to expend energy to go and get food. Your body's really good at being like, hey, let's, down regulate things. So it's really good at adapting up or down. And so again, those are stressors on the body and there's adaptations that happen. I mean, again, even if you're low, let's say you're on the way down, like for example, things like thyroid could slow down. Like that's something that's an
For
adaptation.
sure.
For men, depending on where you're at body fat level wise, testosterone could go down either on the way
Yep.
down or on the way up. So these are all adaptations that are in place. And so that's all stressors on the body, right? Like either way, up or down. And so why we go to maintenance is to take that stress off of the body, right? And like just let it be comfortable because that's going to be, where your body feels the best and where it's going to be able to, just perform, make sure you get, perform your best. And again, where it's at its most comfortable.
Yeah, no, these are really important. People have to understand that there's a cascade of things that happens, right? You mentioned thyroid. There's estradiol for women. There's leptin and ghrelin, which cause hunger, and then if you exacerbate that with lack of sleep, and sometimes people move less when they're in a fat loss phase, you sometimes really need that break. Sometimes it's just for psychological reasons, but there are, because you're going to get back into that adaptation as soon as you start dieting again. But if you don't have that break, you might break, like mentally break and be like, I'm done, and then start sabotaging your progress.
Well, that's where you see most people fall anyways, right? Whether they do it or not, like whether they take a maintenance phase or not, they end up doing that
Yeah.
anyways, right? So yeah, like you said, it's really that like that maintenance phase is going to be there to help take stress off the body because again, it's um, people don't realize, but you're at where you're at because of like the what you've done to it, and again, your body's really good at adapting to things, and so really, if you're having any of these symptoms or anything like that, it's just from what you've been doing, right?
Right.
So
And when you do this, so, you know, there's a little bit of quote unquote controversy about reverse dieting ever since the Trexler article came out. The idea that if you know what your current maintenance is, you just jump to that and recover. There's no need to stretch it out. But we still use the term reverse dieting kind of to mean the same thing for some people. Is that what you do? You just kind of increase carbs, bring them back to their current maintenance when this happens?
Yeah. So you kind of slow down there for a minute. I don't know if there was something wrong with
Yeah,
the
I know
internet,
something
but
weird happened. So all I was asking is that what is your approach with a client in that
yeah,
case? Yep.
yeah. So again, like you mentioned, there's not, if you this was like a bodybuilder or somebody like that, we would have like more of like a recovery diet, right? Where it's like, yes, that person, if they're like super low body fat, again, you're going to see those adaptations happen. Like hormones are going to decrease. Like for them, you would want to get them back to maintenance like as soon as possible. For a more lifestyle client who, maybe they're not, for women, maybe they're not sub 20% body fat. For men, maybe they're not like sub 8, 10%, maybe they're a little bit higher than that, but they're leaner than what they've been. They've been dieting for a while. For that person, I'll do more of like a reverse back to maintenance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is they're not as in bad of a shape as like somebody that's like super, super lean, right? So they
Sure.
they have a little bit of wiggle room there to where we can slowly bring their calories back up and find where their like maintenance is at now. And that can be a good way to just not like, because I feel like if you go from dieting straight to your maintenance, you could see some weight gain come a little bit quicker. And for
Mm-hmm.
some people, they don't want to see that. So I like to use reverse dieting for more lifestyle clients and slowly get them back to their
Yeah.
maintenance and just make sure that we don't overshoot anything on the way up.
Makes
Now,
sense.
again,
Yeah, yeah. And it's practical too, right? There's a sustainability aspect of just not jumping so many calories just from a practical standpoint. Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think too, if you're somebody that is in this situation and you're super worried about regaining weight and reverse dieting, like realize you're already like most of the way there. Like you already have a good plan in place. And so it's like the chances of you going overboard are very low. Whereas, you take somebody on the other end of the spectrum that they just are like, oh, I cannot wait to just go back to what I was doing before. It's like, okay, it's a little bit different there, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
like the fact that you know you need a game plan and you're going to do that, I think is important. I think the downside with like a reverse diet is, and this is kind of what Eric Trexler talked about in his article, is like it's a way to like kind of prolong the calorie deficit in a way. And so you just have to be careful with that you're not like sitting at these body weights
Right.
or deficits that are, you're not sitting in these the body fat levels that are going to cause some of those issues that we talked about from like a
Mhm.
hormonal, biofeedback standpoint. And also making sure that you're not in a deficit for a long period of time. Because again, like we
Right.
talked about, your body's going to adapt to that. Even if it is a small deficit, it is going to continue to adapt to that.
Yeah.
So you just have to make sure that you're not doing it to like maintain some physique that isn't like doable for you,
Right.
Hi, my name is Lisa, and I'd like to give a big shout out to my nutrition coach, Philip. With his coaching, I have lost 17 pounds. He helped me identify the reason that I wanted to lose weight. And it's very simple, longevity. I want to be healthy, active, and independent until the day I die. He introduced me to this wonderful little app called Macro Factor. I got that part of my nutrition figured out. Along with that is the movement part of nutrition. There's a plan to it, and he really helped me with that. The other thing he helped me with was knowing that I need to get a lot of steps in. So the more steps you have, the higher your expenditure is, and the easier it is to lose weight. When it's presented to you like he presents it, it makes even more sense. And the other thing that he had was a hunger guide, and that really helped me. So thank you, Philip.
And I guess last question about maintenance is what should people be tracking, right? We know calories, macros, weight, a couple things there. What are some other key metrics people should track?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So what I like to have clients track is this one I think is the most important. I kind of told you earlier that like how a client feels in the process, I think is super important. So what I like to have clients track is I call it like biofeedback. People call it
Yep.
many different things, but
Sure.
biofeedback is going to be things like, how's your sleep, how are your energy levels, how are your hunger levels. You could throw libido in there. You could throw digestion in there. And so like tracking those things I think are super important because again, if those are in a good spot, like that, to me, that's the most important, whereas like if a client is saying that they're like super hungry or like libido is gone, like they don't have any libido, maybe for a female client, their menstrual cycle, like if those things aren't there, something's like we got to dive deeper and we got to figure out something that's going on there. Right. So like, I think that's the most important thing because in these maintenance phases, reverse diet phases, we want to see biofeedback improve. Right.
Right.
That's the main goal. Right. So you want to make sure that that's in good spot there. So biofeedback for sure, making sure you're in a good spot. Cause like if a client, for example, is, if we're in a reverse diet phase and we're not seeing these things improve and they're like, oh, I'm really scared of weight gain. But you continue to like have that kind of small deficit because you like the client, like, you're worried about bringing them up a little bit higher. It's like, you have to have that honest conversation with them about being like, hey, we probably just need to bring your calories up a little bit more.
Here's what the data showing. That's why you feel that way.
Yep. So biofeedback, I think is super important. Continue to track your training. I think that can be a big thing too, like making sure you're tracking that. Cause like, if you come out of a deficit into maintenance, you're probably going to see a little bit of an uptick in your training. So, I think that's important to track that, make sure that's trending up and whatnot. I think activity levels, I like to have clients track it through steps, just cause that's a good indicator of like overall activity levels. So tracking that, some sort of food monitoring. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be calories and macros. If you did that for your fat loss phase, I would still push you to do that in your maintenance phase afterwards, just for a period of time. You don't have to do it forever. I think people get this mindset towards tracking that's like if they do it once, they either have to do it forever or they never have to do it again. I think there's just like I like to have phases with nutrition. I think there needs to be phases with.
It's a tool. It's a learning tool and a education tool.
Yeah. And so having some periods of time where you do it, you don't do it, I think it's great, but doing it for that period of time afterwards. And if you can, really, really try to minimize the amount of like tasty food you have in that post-diet period, because it's just going to be really hard to moderate and you're just going to want more. So, again, tracking some sort of food intake and then making sure that you, just limit tasty foods as best as you can. I know, again, that's way easier said than done. But I think the big thing is don't like have, if this was your entire, calories that you had and like you had this much be your, like nutrient dense type foods, don't just like all of a sudden like flip it where it's like now you're eating only like 20% nutrient dense foods and 80%, still try to stick to like an 80-90% rule there with that. And then lastly, body weight. I think it's super important to continue to track your body weight in this period of time afterwards, just so again, things aren't getting out of hand. Now, again, having a good coach like yourself to kind of coach people and educate them on like what's going on. Like, hey, if you're in a fat loss phase, you're super depleted, you don't have a lot of food in your system. And all of a sudden, we bring up your calories 200, 300, 400, you're going to see your body weight come up a little bit, right? Like there's
fluid from the carbs.
Yeah. Glycogen stores. Yeah. And just more food in your belly at one time. So, I think also, I guess this goes back to our original topic here of like maintenance. It's like maintenance also isn't just like this one number, right? It's a range, right? So maintenance calories are going to be a range. Your maintenance weight is going to be a range. And so again, just realizing that I think can be super helpful.
For sure. Yeah. I use plus or minus 3 for most people, 3 pounds. Cause it's kind of that good range where, because if you did it too tight and then it's like, what's going on? I'm gaining weight, help, you've got some flexibility.
Well, and two, one other thing on this that just came to my head about the weight thing. There's been times where I've had a client in a fat loss phase and we go back to, it's a reverse diet. We're going to slowly bring their calories back up. I've seen it many times where some clients, they still continue to see their weight trend down a little bit. Right. And I think some of that has to do with, we talk about stress and it's like your body's, in a fat loss phase, again, that's a stressor on the body. And you're probably, you could potentially be holding on to some water weight because of the stress. Right. So sometimes you bring these clients' calories up a little bit and they start to see their weight trend down a little bit. That's also has to do with like, if that, if you bring your calories back up, your body's like more, it's going to expend more energy because you're bringing in more food, things like that. But I've also seen clients where their weight stay the same. And then there's also clients that have seen their weight come up a little bit. Right. So you don't know until you actually do it, but just realize that you could increase calories, so your weight come down a little bit. It could stay the same, or it could come up a little bit in that process.
Yeah. And there's one other piece about maintenance. I'm kind of surprised I didn't bring it up, but the idea that, especially when you're getting started, right, being in a maintenance phase, potentially when you start lifting and when you start putting together all these habits, at least that's something I like to do with clients. I know it's a pretty common approach with good coaches, where you start to see all these magical things happen without the scale changing. And you have to have those conversations of, moving away from focusing on the scale weight for now, at least until they're then mentally ready and physically ready for that fat loss phase.
Yeah, so, no, 100%. And I feel like too, I've seen clients where if they've been that person that's always tried to restrict their calories or be super lean, and that's like all they've ever done, it's like you put them at maintenance and it's like, they're,
It's a
like you
feast,
said,
right?
yeah, everything, like everything
Yeah.
gets better. They feel better.
Yeah.
Training gets better. So that's going to help with muscle growth. So yeah, a lot of, depending on where the person's at, like there's a lot of good things that happen if you've spent a lot of time just always trying to restrict and you get to maintenance, like a lot of good things can happen at that point. I think the big one too is like for women is the menstrual cycle, right? Like they don't realize
Mhm.
that like that's a big thing. If that's off and that's not regular, there's something going on that needs to be worked on. And that's typically comes from like stress, right? Like some sort of
Yeah, for
stress.
sure.
And the thing with stress is a lot of people don't realize that stress is like, it's not just your mental stress of like, oh, work was tough, I got in a fight with
Right.
my spouse. Stress is also like, too high levels of body fat is stress, too low body fat levels is stress on the body. Eating patterns, like if you eat late at night before bed, like that could kind of cause some stress in terms of your circadian rhythm. Like poor sleep is stress, right? So there's like all these other
Yeah.
factors of stress there that play a role. So
Yeah, and then you see HP access issues sometimes as a result, and a lot of those get resolved, right? When you get out of that situation. I mean, I've had clients who, their mode of training is definitely not heavy lifting; it's a lot of cardio, right?
yep.
And as soon as you remove that stress, and you say, "Hey, we're going to lift really heavy weights for 3 days," well, isn't that going to be more stressful? It actually removes the systemic stress,
Yep.
and then all of a sudden, all the adrenal issues and cortisol issues you might have had go away when you're now eating 2,700 instead of 2,200 calories. And by the way, your weight's not changing, is it? It is really, really like magic to some people. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah. That's
absolutely.
great. Cool. So let's talk about recovery. That's the other topic, which kind
Yep.
of overlaps this in some way. Most people, I guess, would think of recovery as restoring your energy, your maybe your glycogen between workouts, maybe not being sore, getting sleep, preventing injury, all those things. How do you define recovery, which I suspect is also one of your biofeedback measures, possibly?
Yeah.
How do you define it? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess the scientific term of recovery is like basically you're back at the point to where you can, in your training session, you can like progress again, essentially, right? Like you're back to like
Yep.
baseline performance levels. That's like the scientific term. For me, I do monitor like a client's biofeedback or recovery. And what I tell them, okay, so like it's going to be on a scale 1 to 5. Like one for like a low, like for one would be poor recovery ability. And like what that's going to look like would be like, you're just like super low energy. You're just like kind of best way I could say is you're just kind of dragging, right? Like you're
Mm-hmm.
dragging, you're just low energy. Maybe you're like super sore, achy. Motivation just is like kind of down the drain. You're just not feeling great. Your training session sucks. Like you're just not feeling good in your training session. You're super hungry, you just feel depleted, right? Like that to me that's poor recovery ability, right? Good recovery ability is going to obviously be the opposite of that, right? Like you have high energy, you're feeling great throughout the day. Hunger, depending on what phase you're in, hunger is not like super high or something like that, right? Like you feel sustained energy, you're feeling strong in your training sessions, you're feeling super motivated to train, to hit your goals. You could also throw like libido in there too, right? Like I've hit on that a couple times. If that's kind of in the gutter, like that's
Mm-hmm.
poor recovery ability. That's a sign of some sort of stress going on. You're under recovering somewhere. So again, on the opposite end, your libido's good, right? Like
Sure.
those are all like good signs there of, and that's how I typically tell clients like what that looks like there.
Okay. Yeah, and wouldn't you say, so there's a subjective and an objective kind of element to this, and where I'm going with that is personal experience and clients who have said, "Hey, I felt sluggish going to the gym. I felt weak. I felt like there's no way I was going to get this, and all of a sudden they get a PR, right? Like, where would you place that in this spectrum?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, right? I mean, I think at that point, like if like I know you said and it is very subjective, right? So I think getting this data is important, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
in tracking it, but as a coach, and like even if you're just doing this for yourself, you don't have a coach, you're just doing this for yourself, you do need to like check into it a little bit as well too,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Sure.
ask yourself a little bit more about it, because like you said, it could be something where it's like you do feel that way, but then you go in, like you said, you hit a PR. So yes, I do think that can happen. So honestly, that would to me fall under the recovery aspect too, where like you go and train and it's like you actually end up hitting a PR, right? Like, okay, then maybe your recovery is not as bad as it could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Like to me, that tells me that it's not as bad as it was, right? So like that would be a sign of like better recovery than you think if you're going in and hitting
Right.
a PR. I think too, sometimes, people have certain metrics, whether that be like HRV or they have like a whoop or something like that. And it will like tell them they're not recovering. So then like mentally you
It's
think that that's the
psychosomatic.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Placebo effect. Yeah.
And so I think you need to be careful with that. For sure. And then even like too, we talk about sleep and it's like, oh, I got a poor night's sleep.
Yeah.
So you go into that training session like, oh, this is going to be terrible. So like you do have to check yourself on this a little bit and like, don't put too much stock into one single thing, So that's what I would tell clients on it. Now again, like you said, it's subjective. So there's definitely going to be a potential like error with it. But I think it's more so when we're like noticing trends of like a client's consistently putting like 1, 2, or 3, and then, their training performance is actually showing that as well too. That's where it's like, hey, we definitely need to take more than one single day of this. Like it's going to take some time to really figure it out too. But I think what it does is it allows you to like look into things a little bit more and like just kind of double check, hey, could this potentially be off? Like, okay, maybe it is my sleep. Am I doing something sleep wise that's off? Am I maybe training a little bit too much? Am I pushing, you know what I mean? Things like that.
Oh, totally agree. Then you can correlate it with other factors like you did stall in your lift or something, I ask this because a lot of people, especially as you get older, you deal with all sorts of aches and pains. You deal with, especially low back fatigue is very common, or low back pain. I personally have had days where I felt low back soreness, but then I know the type of soreness is fine and I can go do my workout. It's going to feel better. Other days, it's like, no, if I push this, something's going to pop, right? And you kind of get to know your body over time. Have you found that personally with you?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think you definitely, it's definitely going to take you some time to figure out like, okay, is this a pain that I'm going to push through, or is this a pain that like, hey, I really need to take it easy. Right. So yeah, no, I think learning your body, I think in the beginning, if you are feeling that, like if you're, within like a year or so of training and this is happening, I do think you probably want to dial back your intensity a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just because you don't know yet, like you said.
For sure.
But I do think in that situation, if you do have any sort of like, let's say recovery, you rate it as low, you have maybe some aches and pains. I think we need to be careful with like not that meaning like, oh, hey, I'm just going to lay around all day.
Overreacting. Yeah. Right.
Because I think that's going to that will probably make things worse. Whereas like in that situation, maybe you just go in and like you have a little bit of low back pain. And in your mind, you're like, oh no, if I don't go balls to the wall in this session, I'm going to lose all my progress. But I think as you get more experience, you realize that it's all about like finding things that are going to keep you going for long periods of time. Sure. So maybe that day it is just like dialing it back a little bit, and it's more of just a lighter training session. Just showing up and getting in is that's what you need to do that day. And, that could be the thing that you get some blood flow to the area. It starts to feel better. Or maybe for you, it's like, hey, for me today, I'm just going to go and get some steps in or something like that. Right. Cause I think with the steps, that's one of those tricky ones that I always have this conversation with clients where they're like, oh, I was super tired today, so I just didn't do any steps. And, then it's like, well, I think part of your issue is you didn't get that activity, right? I'm sure you've had those days where
you get stiffened up, affects the joints, affects recovery, et cetera.
Yeah. You get stiffened up and then just laying around. I just feel like you just get this sense of like, you just get more tired doing it. Right. And so I think in that situation, maybe it is just going for a walk. Right. And so I think what I'm trying to say is like, you still need to do something, but in terms of the intensity that you're going, maybe that's not the day that you go and try to hit that PR on deadlift or something like that. You just dial it back and still get something in, because I think that's important.
Yeah. And you touched on intensity. And so what I want to look at the variables here, the training variables, right? You've got volume, got intensity, frequency, exercise selection. I'm not a personal trainer per se, but I help my clients a lot with that and give them form checks. And one of the things I like to do is kind of invert the volume math. If the sets of 5 are just going to be too stressful, if you feel like that's just impossible, maybe we turn it to 3 sets of 5 become 5 sets of 3 or something, so you can change the intensity one way or the other. So how do we manipulate these variables? And also, there's confusion around this with recovery. Like I've heard, hey, I'm not going to work out 5 or 6 days a week because I'm in a fat loss phase. But there's kind of a premise there that more days means more stress, when that's not always true, right? Because sometimes shorter sessions on more days can reduce systemic stress. So how do we make sense of it all?
Yeah. So I think with that, like you said, they're all kind of related to each other, right? It's like, I guess the best way to describe it would be like anybody that's ever like that's played a video game where you like create your own player. It's like you basically, you can't have everything be at the max, right? Like if you want to be like the strongest, then you're well, then you can't be like the fastest either, right? Like you're going to have to take a hit on those other like kind of traits or attributes, whatever you want to call them. And so it's kind of the same thing, right? It's like I think the more often you train, so frequency, if you train 6 days a week, you're going to have to manage it to where maybe volume's a little bit lower per session, right? Or maybe intensity's a little bit lower per session, or not every time you train, you're going to like have these exercises that are going to be like super fatiguing, right? So like take like a Romanian deadlift, that's going to be pretty fatiguing on the body. And so maybe you're not going to be able to do that every training session, right? You're going to have to maybe do like a leg curl one day or something like that. Something that again, people are like, oh, that's a machine isolated exercise. Do we want to do that or not? It's like, well, it just depends on that, right? So again, intensity probably will have to go down a little bit. You're not going to be able to train to failure every single set for every exercise. Whereas say you have somebody that trains 3 days a week, it's like, okay, now we can probably push failure a little bit. Like you can go a little bit closer to failure because you're just not training as much overall. The volume per session could probably be a little bit higher. Now, again, there's still, there comes a point where you can't just keep doing more and more volume. So there's going to be, there's going to be a point to where like, if you can only train 3 days, there's going to be some limitations there. But again, you can maybe pick exercises that are a little bit more fatiguing and you can do those each session. So all these things, play a role, and they're all tools really there. Right. So that's kind of the best way that I guess I could describe that. I don't know if that answered all your questions on it, but if you had
no, people are just wondering like which of these have the biggest impact? Is it the volume, like, in the tonnage really? Because, maybe intensity load on the bar isn't what's stressful, except it could be if you're doing a lot of deadlifts and you can't do that 3 times a week. So, or does it depend? I mean, the answer is always it depends, right?
I think overall volume is the number one thing though, right? Like that's going to be the most important thing there in terms of like what's going to be most fatiguing, because I think no matter what, once you get like I just said with that 3 day a week, it's like, yeah, you can do more volume per workout, but at some point there is going to be that point where it's like, okay, now it's just too much volume that it's going to be junk volume. You're not going to you're going to be doing more for like way less return on it. So I do think at the end of the day, volume is, going to be the number one thing there in terms of what's going to, like, same thing for like if somebody that runs, they'd like to do a lot of running. It's like the biggest thing there is the amount of volume that they have to do. Right. But all these other things are just tools that we can kind of manipulate that. But intensity is going to be a big one too, I think, but with intensity, it's like the less you train, the more intense you can go. You can go.
So then what's the difference between, with age, right? Because I know I can't train like I could when I was 22, and I wish I actually did train like I'm trying to train now when I was 22, but I did. It's all right. So age, we get into our 40s and up, and also between men and women.
Yeah. So as far as the age thing goes, it's definitely, I think as you get older, like the volume you can do is definitely going to go down, right? There's no doubt about that. But I also think that has a lot to do with, I think it has, genetics are going to play a role in just aging in general, but I still think that has more to do with lifestyle than what people want to attribute it to, right? I mean, just think about it. When you were 20, it was like, yes, you could get away with less sleep, but you were still probably sleeping more than you do now.
Oh, yeah.
You had way more free time to do whatever you wanted. And again, that's going to be part of the recovery and stress process. You just had less responsibilities back then. So it was like,
you didn't have the kids, you didn't have the pets, you didn't have the big house and the mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So I think that's going to play a big role in it. Right. So, but as you age, it's definitely going to be, you're definitely not going to recover as well as you did when you were younger. So, this is where, like, as you get older, I think it's important to really get your execution and technique and everything dialed in, because, again, when you're younger, you can get away with like, hey, if your form's off a little bit, it's no big deal. Like, you're going to be fine. Whereas as you get older, you have all that wear and tear of everything else that you did for years. I think each time your technique is off a little bit, I think it's going to play a bigger role. Right. So I'm a huge fan of, like, when people are trying to build muscle, like the best thing you can do is really focus on that execution and technique. Don't think that it's always about like just trying to push yourself to the wall, like as far as you can, doing as much as you can. Like, you're going to have to dial it back. And the best thing you can do is get away with getting more out of each rep, because I think that's going to really help with the injury aspect of it. And again, as you know, the best thing you can do is do things that you're going to be able to do for long periods of time. That's where you're really going to see that big difference there, with everything. So
yeah, Yeah, you know, the whole thing about form, it's spot on, and yet I can't tell you how many guys I've seen, men and women, but I'm in a barbell club. It's a lot of dudes that are like 40, 50 years old, and every day it's some lesson about how they hurt themselves and how they're not going to do it again. And it's like we just don't learn. You know, you almost
Yep.
have to go through a little. I did that myself. I ended up having back surgery, not because of lifting, but it definitely made me more conscious of every time I lift, I'm going to focus on a cue for this lift, every rep, every time I go, forever. Like that's so important.
Well, you
Yeah.
know, I think too, for one, for guys, it's more of an ego thing, right? Like
Sure.
like, you know, I think that's the big thing there. It's all about, oh, this person does this, so I got to match that. But it's like how you perform that lift is just so important, right? I had this conversation with Steve Hall actually, and like we talked about how like you would, you know, you used to see these guys in the gym that would do like they would have like 2 plates on there, and you'd be like, oh, that's amazing, but you never really like paid attention to how they did that, how they actually performed it, right? And that is such a big part of it. So you know, I think that's important. But then you have people on the other side that I think overly focus on technique and then they don't
Right.
ever
And
progress.
they
So
stayed light. Yeah. Got it.
so you need to find that happy medium there. But you know, with the weight training, I think the reason that's so important to get good technique is because you got to think you're doing, you know, multiple reps, multiple sets per week. And again, you mess up, if your form's not perfect once, it's no big deal. But you know, you do that over and over again, and these things do start to add up. That's why with like weight training, you don't see a lot of like acute injuries where it's like it happens right then and there. It's more of this like buildup of like you
Built
have
up.
like more aches and like tendinitis
Tendinitis. Yeah. Yeah.
and things like
Sure.
that.
Yeah. So what about you? What about your personal approach to recovery? You know, you've probably dealt with some setbacks, some failure, you know, injuries, things like that. What have you dealt with that?
Can I actually? I
Yeah.
know you had one more question there about the women
Oh yes.
recovering,
Yeah.
the
Right.
difference. Do
Yep.
you mind if I go over that
No,
real
no,
quick?
go for it, please.
Well, I was going to say women on average tend to recover a little bit quicker
Mm.
than men do. They just the way
Yep.
that their bodies are, they can recover a little bit quicker. And that goes for like in between sets, in between sessions. You know, part of it too is probably like men do have more muscle mass than women do generally, right? So I think that probably plays a big role. And again, just like absolute weight lift, it's going to play a role in that. But women do tend to recover a little bit quicker. And so really all like, what does that mean? I mean, all that means for women is they can probably get away with a little bit more training volume. Like their programs might have a little bit more volume than like compared to men. Again, this is generally,
It's a
this is
double-edged sword, right? Because you
yeah.
need that volume too. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they can maybe rest a little bit,
Shorter. Yeah.
shorter
Yeah.
in between
Mhm.
sets. But again, you know, obviously individual variation there is the most important. And you obviously have to kind of see it for yourself in
That's a good
terms of
point.
what that's going to look like. So.
Yeah, women should be aware, and all this stuff is on average, right? Like every individual is going to be respond differently. There is. It's funny you mentioned about the weight because I remember looking into this not long ago. There are some actual genetic differences that independent of the weight lifted that do help women recover better. I just don't remember the details. Estrogen's involved, but I don't remember the rest of it.
Estrogen,
Yeah.
and I think too, women typically have like more type 1 muscle
Yes.
fibers
Yes. Exactly.
than men,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
those are a little bit more fatigue resistant, and they can recover
There
quicker.
we go.
They're a little bit more like endurance type muscles.
Right. I knew you'd have the answer. So there you go. Yeah. So then, what about you? What is there any particular story you've got about recovery?
Yeah. So I think for me, this is going to be, so you kind of mentioned this, I did have like, for a while, I just would always run into shoulder issues. And again, that just came down to me being young, dumb, just always training like upper body and like bench press and like chest. But also for me, it was just, I felt like I was at the, like, this was like probably I'm 31. I always forget how old I am now, 31. And when I was in my like early to mid 20s, it was all about like, I wanted to be jacked. So I just would try to train 6, 7 days a week. I didn't really pay attention to nutrition, sleep. I was like, what the hell, sleep? That doesn't matter. And it was like, if I went 2 days without training, I was like, oh crap,
Gonna lose all my
I'm
gains.
going to lose all my gains, you know? And so it was all about just going in the gym and just like hammering out like volume and just going for the pump, just doing as much as I could.
Arnold style, right?
Yep. And
Yeah.
while I do think that will lend itself to some results for a little bit, if you just keep doing that, it's like eventually your body's just going to be under recovered, and you know, you're just not going to see any progress, right? Because you know, if you train too much and you don't have the recovery there, and again, this can be calories, this can be how many days off of training you take. Like if you don't have that in place, your body's going to prioritize recovering before it's going to prioritize building muscle. So you could be doing all this stuff, and
Sure.
you're just, I don't want to say you're wasting your time because it can be good for you, but you're not going to see the results you want. You're going to be putting in a lot of work for not a lot. So for me, a big part of learning more was like, man, I need to focus more on things outside of the gym, right? So things that can really improve recovery again, or, obviously taking some time away from fat loss dieting that can improve recovery, like being at maintenance, like that can help. Being a surplus, that can help a little bit. Sleep, working on your sleep, that can be helpful with the recovery side of things. That can increase how much you can do. Managing your stress, and then, again, this is mental stress, but also the other stressors that I was talking about earlier. That can be helpful, and then your training program as well too, right? So we talked about frequency, intensity, like managing all that and making sure that you're not just like training balls to the wall every single day and just like that's going to be super important. And game changer for me. And that's, again, going to come down to like your programming and things like that. But also another big thing too is like making sure that you're not like, if muscle building is your main goal, making sure that you're not like trying to weight train, but then also you're like trying to play 3 sports on the side. You're trying to run a marathon like that. That also goes into the recovery aspect of it as well too. I had one more. I hope it comes back to me here in a second. There was one more that I wanted to say that I think is big, but I think getting all the getting your training variables in play are going to be super important. But yeah, those would be the big things there.
People are going to have to follow your podcast to get the other one, because you're teasing it. It's that other one.
I wish it was. I can't think of it.
It's all good. No, it's all good, man. You know how these go. There's only so much you can cram into one conversation here.
Yep.
So, all right, cool. I know we're running short on time. Just a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Of course, man. Yep.
I want to pick your brain about the podcast, the Mind Muscle Connection, because you've had all these big names on your show. At least they're big. They're idols to me. I love listening to these guys. And we were talking before about the friendships and connections you make. Who's been the most influential because of the personal relationships from podcasting?
Man, that is a good question. I saw that on there and I was like, man, who is it going to be? So, I would, like I told you off air, everybody that comes on, I feel like I do take away something from, and it's really changed my mind on things. And I'm really grateful for that. People that I think have had the greatest influence from having them on the podcast. Brian Borstein's a big one. He does my programming now. So Brian Borstein's a good one. I think you just had him on recently. Brandon DeCruz has had a big impact. Jeremiah Bear is another one that's had a big impact on me. I would say those are probably my top 3. I followed Steve Hall for a long time and always love chatting with him. I always get a ton out of chats with him. But I mean, I've also had other like Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, like those are great guys too. But in terms of like people I've had on reoccurring, those would probably be the biggest like 3 for me.
Those are great names. Great names for people to look up and find a show. So I have a funny story about Eric Helms and Eric Trexler. So as I was reaching out to folks like you to be on my show, I reached out to Eric Helms, or at least I thought I did. And it was Eric Trexler. And I had said all this stuff had nothing to do with him. And he's like, thanks, man, but you got the wrong Eric. I'm like, oh, that's so embarrassing. And he's like, don't worry, it happens all the time. I said, I'll hit you up later. Let some time pass past the awkward moment. I'll get back to you. And I hope he still wants to come on, because I got his partner, Greg Knuckles, to come on in a few months, because I use Macro Factor and a bunch of my clients do, and I love talking all that stuff. So, and then the reverse dieting and all that stuff. Cool, man. Brian Borstein, Brandon DeCruz, Jeremiah Bear, Steve Hall, and others. So really cool.
Yeah. Right. That's funny with Eric Trexler. I'm sure he was, like you said, that's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last time that happens. So
no, I have to butter him up when I make the request again. Have you received, you receive a lot of feedback from listeners, I'm sure, for the podcast as well. Like, what's some of the most memorable feedback that you've gotten?
Yeah, I think, I haven't, I guess more so from clients would probably be where I would take this, because I think you kind of also had like clients in there as well too. And, I think for me to go back to what we talked about earlier, it's, obviously helping people get like their physique goals and like the body composition goals that they want. But anytime I get like a message from a client that's like, hey, I either got to like, I got a promotion and this helped, like, or it's like, hey, my doctor said I can get off blood pressure medication, or like, hey, I'm fitting into these clothes I haven't fit into for years, or like anything like that. Like, to me, those are the best like messages to get, because like I said, I think if you can improve somebody's quality of life, like that's just, you can't buy that. And like, that's, it's invaluable. And so those are my favorite, like, kind of feedback that I've gotten from people. And even too, like, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head from like a podcast standpoint. Like, people are like, hey, listen, I enjoy it. But like, anytime you get a message on like social media about like, hey, I've been, they don't like your stuff, but they're like, hey, I've been following along and, you've really helped me out. Like, those are always the best ones. And, anytime you can improve somebody's quality of life, I think it's amazing. So
I agree. And don't discount the fact that there are a lot of guys like me who are coaches or getting into coaches who listen to guys like you who are also learning to be better coaches. And you're basically exponentially, making a bigger impact that way.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yep. Yeah. That too. Right. You definitely don't think about that too. So no, that's great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool, man. So I think you know what's coming next because you obviously are well prepared and looked at my bullet list of topics. But what question did you wish I had asked? And what is your answer?
Oh man. I did see this one and I was like, you know what, maybe we'll run out of time on this one. So what question do I wish you would have asked me that you didn't? And what's my answer? So I think it would be, what is my favorite sport?
Okay. All right. Personal question. Cool.
Is that what we wanted? Is that what
I wouldn't have thought to ask that. So yeah, go for it. What's your favorite sport?
So it's hockey. I love hockey. My favorite team is the St. Louis Blues. So I'm a big hockey fan. And I play roller hockey once a week. And so that's kind of like my cardio. So that would be my question. Kind of a cop out on that one, but
not at all, man. No, it's good to learn more about you for sure. Hockey. It's funny. I grew up in Florida, so I didn't grow up watching hockey, but then I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic. It's an engineering school in New York, and they were a Division I hockey team. So
nice.
There's nothing like watching hockey in person is awesome. For people listening, it's great. Yeah.
Oh, it is. So I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. So I think I might have just said that, but St. Louis Blues are my team. But man, I'll tell you what, if you've never been to a hockey game, you gotta go. It's freaking amazing. Where do you live at now?
I'm in Connecticut.
Connecticut. Got you.
No professional sports here. Yeah. Right. Resurrecting that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Yeah. Actually, the Final Four, right? UConn's in there with Miami. And because I'm from Miami and a Canes fan, and I also have to root for UConn. It's a little bit of a conflict up here. Yeah.
Well, I guess this is now you get to find out who you're really rooting for.
I guess so. It's whoever my wife tells me to. No,
that's true.
Yeah. All right, man. So where can listeners learn more about you?
Yeah. So podcasts, like you mentioned, Mind Muscle Connection, three episodes a week. I have a guest once a week as well too. Instagram is where I'm most active. So Jeff, HOEHN _. And so those would be the top two places that I'm most active on and where I would push people to.
Cool. I'll do that. I'll put that in the show notes, the podcast for sure, which is an easy request because you're already listening to a podcast. So just go follow his and then IG Jeff Hoehn _. Yep. All right, man. It's been an awesome conversation. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. It's like I said off air, it's always interesting to be on the guest side of things, but it's always fun to chat. And I honestly feel like this went by pretty quickly. So love the questions, man. And I love what you're doing and keep it up.
Likewise, learn from the best. All
yes,
right,
sir.
Take care.
Thank you.